As we get deeper into fall 2023, the Sweater Weather Quilt Along continues. This video covers Block 3, Woolen, and Block 4, Home Heart. If you're ready to embrace the warmth of quilting during sweater weather, let's get started. The Woolen block by Abby Maed Patterns is a play on classic wool blanket motifs. Companies like Pendleton still sell these blankets today with Aztec style prints. I knew antique wool blankets were collectible, but when I was doing research on these blankets for this video, I found a ton of history associated with them. Indigenous people would trade blankets for things like furs, which were highly desirable in the European market. Indigenous people could also be very picky about with whom they traded because the demand for furs was high enough that multiple traders would often come through with different goods available. So there were a variety of different companies that started producing wool blankets. These blankets became known as Indian trade blankets. These blankets were extremely popular for trading through about 1890 and saw use as far more than just bedding. They were repurposed as sails on sleds and canoes, saddles, and cut into clothing like coats. Native tribes, particularly the Navajo, began weaving blankets and trading with white and indigenous people in the surrounding area. When the Indian Wars finally ended in 1890, federally licensed Indian trading posts were established, and after that point, the Navajo rug overtook other woven textile production on most reservations, which is much thicker than the traditional Navajo wearing blanket. So all of that brings us back to Pendleton. Because the Navajo shifted to making rugs for white homes, frontier mills developed to fill the gap in the market for blankets made for indigenous people. So you wind up with this situation where indigenous people were making rugs for white homes and white people were making blankets for indigenous homes. Pendleton was one of many manufacturers of these Indian trade blankets, but they are the only ones left in existence today. That's why Pendleton blankets look the way that they do. The motifs and colors and patterns that were used in these blankets were meant to appeal to a native audience because that was the consumer of the product. So all of that is a lot of background to say this quilt block was inspired by classic wool blanket motifs. I wish the designer would have acknowledged some of that history in the pattern, but it was easy enough to do the research on my own. TikTok has been a tizzy with how frequently men think about the Roman Empire, and I think this might be my Roman Empire, is craft history. Do you get sucked into history like I do? Let me know your history obsession in the comments, whether it's crafting related or not. The quilt block is made of mostly flying geese and half-square triangles, though there are some larger strips included as well. The block is actually built from the center out. It starts with a sawtooth star, but instead of a plain center, there's flying geese as the center blocks. Then you add contrasting strips around that center star. You start with a layer of white with color accents, then color with white accents, and finally white with color accents again. I saw a lot of people on the Facebook group for this quilt along struggling with the block assembly. There are a lot of pieces, and it's really easy to get them mixed up. I definitely did that. My advice is to go slow and work center out like the pattern is written. Think of them more like borders than rows and you'll be on the right track. I really love the look of this block, but I found the cutting instructions very fussy, which is a complaint that I had about the Abby Maed Twinkle Lights quilt that I talked about in my podcast last month. It was also pretty easy to get the sewing mixed up, and I had to rip several times. I did like the construction of it though. My block actually came out perfectly sized at the end, which I was surprised about. I think that this would be an absolutely gorgeous block to make into a full-size quilt, either with multiple of the same block or maybe just a giant version of this block made to look like a giant Pendleton blanket. Okay, after all of that, Home Heart, the next block by Dreamland Quilting was a breeze. This house block is similar to the Shaker House block, but with a heart instead of a door. This one has some long, narrow strips of background fabric, so making sure I got accurate cuts was very important. My background fabric had gotten a little bit wonky while I was cutting for my falling leaves block, so I used the fabric tearing method to realign to the grain. I'd made hearts very similarly to this in my I Heart You quilt, which is by Then Came June and Pen and Paper Patterns, so making the heart was super simple for me. Sewing this block was done in a snap. First you build your heart, then the walls, and then the roof. Then you assemble everything together. I chose to snowball my block at the very end after squaring up the block because I did want to make sure that it was perfectly 20.5 inches square. But for some reason I wound up 1/4 inch short, so I'll have to deal with that when assembling the blocks together. It's time for me to step away from my sewing machine for a few days and pick my knitting back up. The next block will be available tomorrow, and it's a big giant curve, so we'll see how that goes. I've included a link to the quilt along in the description below, and be aware that the blocks will only be available until November 3rd, so make sure to sign up if you're interested in any of these blocks. I'll be back in a few weeks with a Sweater Weather Quilt Along update, and on Monday for my monthly podcast. Until next time, happy crafting, and may your 1/4 inch seams always be scant.